My friends, looking at this chart, you can see the breakdown of the earliest Jesus group communities and how they were in New Testament times. It is in this second wave where we are to find the historical Paul, situated between the Jesus movement and the evangelists called Mark and Matthew. I have a question for you. How did Paul view himself? Going by his 7 undisputed letters, it becomes quite clear that Paul thought of himself as an Israelite prophet sent by the God of Israel to Israelites living in the Mediterranean as émigré minority groups among non-Israelite majorities. Paul was not interested in non-Israelites, whether they belonged to the Jesus groups or not. Paul was interested in giving his message, the gospel of God, to Israelites. Paul was an apostle to his fellow Israelites living among non-Israelites. Paul was what we 21st century Western people would call a change agent, someone commissioned by God to proclaim and prepare for the forthcoming theocracy, soon to be inaugurated by the return of the risen Jesus, who was appointed by the God of Israel as Israel's Messiah and cosmic Lord. Let's go over a quick biography of Paul, from the time of his birth up until when he became a follower of Jesus. Context scholars, the Stegeman brothers, established that Paul was probably born in Upper Galilee, in a place called Gishala. At the time, the place Gishala was a center for the Zealots, Israelite rebels determined to fight back for their ancestral lands that had been stolen from them by greedy elites, manipulating kangaroo courts and their Roman masters. Sometime after 4 BCE, his family was sold into slavery and likely purchased by a Roman citizen in Tarsus in Asia Minor, present-day Turkey. The young Paul would have been an Aramaic-speaking Israelite, although outside Syro-Palestine, he spoke Greek. Spurious familiarity breeds the common misconception that upon becoming a follower of Christ, Saul changed his name to Paul, as if Saul was his Jewish name and Paul was his Christian baptized name. That is not true. Saul or Paul always had these two names. At home with his Israelite in-group and family members, he would have been called by the Semitic name Saul. But when traveling outside his home, with Mediterranean outsiders, he would have gone by his outsider name, Paul. The name Saul, or Shaul, is basically the Semitic word sha'al, which means to ask. Perhaps Saul's mother had asked God for a child, and God had answered her positively, and this is why he was named Saul. The closest equivalent in Greek to Shaul is Saulus. If Saulus had been Saul's chosen outgroup name, his Greek name, then he would have had even a more difficult life than he had. In Greek, Saulus meant waddler, one who walked like a prostitute. This is not unlike the homophobic insult sometimes heard among various Latino communities referring to flamboyantly gay persons as pato, or duck. In any case, Paulus was chosen, which isn't really much better, because it means small. Paul knew the Septuagint, the Greek translated scriptures, very well. He quoted these Greek texts about 90 times in his authentic letters. This tells us he got educated in Tarsus, likely at the university there. This is where he became very familiar with Stoicism. In Stoicism, everything that you experience in life happens according to divine reason and purpose. So what do? Acquiesce! About 15 Common Era, when Paul was roughly 20 years old, and after completing his Greco-Roman education, he would have been a relatively assimilated Mediterranean diaspora Israelite. Around this time his owner died, and he would have been freed from his slavery. The young Paul then traveled back to Syro-Palestine, this time to its very heart, the temple city, Jerusalem. That is approximately 500 miles distance, which would take 6 weeks for Paul, walking. In Jerusalem, Paul became a Pharisee, not to be confused with later post-Talmudic rabbis. Biblical scholar John Meyer reminds us that we know precious little about the Pharisees, much less than we think in our spurious familiarity. The Pharisees were shamanic, adept in experiencing and inducing in others alternate states of consciousness experiences. Paul remained a Jerusalem Pharisee for about 2 decades, and around the age of 40 encountered the risen Jesus in alternate reality, accepting him as Israelite Messiah. Even though Paul and Jesus were about the same age and both physically in Syro-Palestine around the same times, Paul never had met the pre-Paschal Jesus. Paul's life-changing encounter with Messiah Jesus took place in an alternate state of consciousness. The way Paul, in his own letters, describes this life-changing encounter with the risen Jesus is very different than the way Luke writes about it in the document we call Acts of the Apostles, where he describes it happening on the way to Damascus. Again, the Paul we learn about in Acts of the Apostles is a theological fiction. The Bible is all true, and some of it actually happened.